All right, guys, so today is going to start a series of days where we focus on one particular project, and that is going to be our news site project. We're going to be building a website that kind of shows news articles, and we'll be designing that using React. And hopefully this will help us gain a better understanding of all the components that go into place for creating a React app. So yeah, with that, we're just going to get started. We're going to be focusing on functional versus class-based components. So we'll be creating this project in two different ways. And then also be talking about props and states, because that's kind of the name of the game with React. So let's kind of just get started here. And so I just want to mention, you guys aren't expected to code along with us. This is going to be your this is going to be your evening challenge for tonight. So kind of just make sure you understand what we're doing and then be able to recreate it on your own as you're doing it this evening. All right, so I'm going to start this challenge. First thing I want to do, as always, is fork this over. Let's get that forked over to my personal account. All right, that should be done. All right, I'm going to grab the URL. We've done this, git clone, paste the URL. And I want to get into that folder, cd sites. I'll bring it up. Okay, so VS Code popping up here. Let me scoot it onto its own desktop. Okay, so when you check out this project, you should see what I see here. There should be a source folder with some data files in it. So we have a data folder with some items that we're going to work with and some components that we're going to implement. All right, so to get this project started, again, I'm just going off the README, so let's actually read the README. To start, we need to create a new React app. So to do that, we're going to run npx create React app and call our project new site 1. I believe lowercase is required for naming, so we could try to name it with an uppercase and see if React likes that or not. After we create a new project, we want to copy over the folders that we just saw in our checkout. So there's a components folder, a data folder, and there's also an app.js that should exist. So yep, we have an app.js. So we're going to copy these over into our new React project once we check that out. So let's get that going here. So I'm going to bring up my terminal. Again, to create a new React app, we want to run npx create -react app. And then news site 1 or news site I is what I'm going with. I believe, just check this out. If you try to uppercase, you might get an error. So since this takes a while, I'm not going to actually try that, but you guys can try it at home. I'm just going to go with lowercase. So this is going to take a hot minute to check out everything. Meanwhile, let's kind of take a look at the README while that's doing its thing. So we're going to be implementing some components that are kind of stubbed out for us. So we have the base bare bones for it. We need to add some logic to it. So we have something called article teaser. This is kind of like an article headline object that we're going to see in on our homepage. So this is going to have a few attributes to it. We have ID, title, created date, and a handler function. We're also going to create an article component. So if we're kind of going back to our Django days, I'd say this is good. Our article teaser is what's going to be on our list view, where we have like a list of news articles. Our article component is going to be our article detail page, where we actually show the real items for the article. And then after we complete the article component, we're also going to create a nav bar. So this is just be our navigation for our website, and that's what we're going to implement or start implementing, at least with this iteration. So as I mentioned, this can be next, I think, 6 days. We're going to have 6 iterations of the new site. We're going to be building upon the previous day's new site. So make sure you do complete this challenge each night, because if you don't, you're going to kind of get behind from there. I know there's some other challenges you guys might want to get to, but focus on the new site challenges for each day first, if you guys can. All right, let's check our React here. It is still taking some time, I think. Hopefully that's almost done. Okay, nope, false alarm. All right, there we go. So happy hacking. We should have our React project. So if I open up new site I, It should have the familiar folders to us. We have node modules that has all the React libraries. Again, this is a giant folder. I'm not going to bother looking into that. We have our public folder. Again, this is where your index.html lives. This is what page is rendered to the web browser. But we don't normally touch anything in the public folder. As developers, we care about the SRC folder. So index.js is our main entry point into our application. This is the first thing that's going to get called by index.html. If you look at this, there should be a index.js in here. Okay. All right, I'm not sure how it's linked here. Link. All right, regardless, index.js is our entry point here. So this renders an app component. So there's not much in our index.js, but our app.js is where we start adding what we want to add, because this is the main component that's rendered from the index.js. So again, just reading the README, we need to copy a few files over. So we have this SRC folder. We want to copy over components. So I'm going to drag and drop components into here. All right, and then take data, do the same. And then app.js, I want to replace my existing app.js. So I'm just going to delete the existing one and drop in the replacement. All right, so my other SRC folder can go away. And now we should have the new app.js that has some logic built into it. And then we should have our data and components folders as such. All right, so let's take a gander at app.js, kind of make sure we know what we're working with. Always good to not just copy and paste, but kind of try to understand what we're working with. All right, so looking at this, we have a class-based component. We're using class app that extends component from React. So again, you need to import component from the React library in order to use it for your class-based component. I know there's a question about constructor, so let's actually talk about that. So if I bring up a window, let's just bring up, what is it? Today is Wednesday. I'll call it Wednesday.py and then Wednesday.js. All right, so we're just going to create two classes quickly. So in Python, just as a review, when we create a class, we use the class keyword, and then we give our class a name. So let's just say, let's call this class Wednesday. And you can pass in a base class here. So let's say we had a class of day as our base class. Then if we want to inherit from day, we'd simply pass in day here. And now Wednesday is basically inheriting everything that day offers it. In this case, there's nothing coming in. And then Wednesday is going to add on to that functionality. Generally, as our constructor, as in the first method that's going to get called when we create a Wednesday instance. Does anyone remember what is the first method that's called when we create an instance?
You under init.
Yep, Reno's got it. So init, and then this takes in a self keyword and then some parameters. So let's say, we had a task list we want to pass in, and then I don't know, quotes of the day. I don't know, I'm just going to add living here. So let's say those are our values. We usually pass them into the init method so that whenever you create a Wednesday instance, you must specify a task list and a quote of the day in the way I've designed it here. So I have task list, I'm going to assign those to instance attributes. So these are just variables that the caller is passing in, as in whoever is creating this object going to pass in some data. You need to store that data within the instance so that the instance kind of owns that data. So in this case, task list and self.quote of the day. I would go with self.quote equals quote of the day. And these names don't have a match, obviously. So there we go. So in effect, this init method is what's known as a constructor. So you're gonna hear constructor in other languages like C++. There's an idea of a constructor. Basically, when we say constructor, it's when you create an instance. So in this case, let's create an instance. W equals a Wednesday instance. Let's say a task list will be complete use site 1. And eat some cereal. All right, so those are our tasks for Wednesday. And then quote of the day. Anyone got a quote of the day for me? No? All right, we'll go with.
Life's a garden, dig it.
All right, I love that quote. Life is a garden. Dig it. All right, so that's our quote of the day for Wednesday. All right, so when we create this instance of Wednesday, this init method is what's going to construct it. So that's where the name constructor comes from. This is what's going to kind of build our instance, where we have task list and quote kind of set up here. All right, so this is in Python. So hopefully that wasn't too much new material, or hopefully you guys remember how to create classes. So we go over to JavaScript. So let me do a split screen here. Let's get rid of that. And okay, so in JavaScript, we have similar syntax, but not quite the same. So if I want to create a class, I can create a class just like I could do in Python. So we'll call it Wednesday. But instead of using parentheses to inherit, we use extends. So extends and then some base class. In this case, day will be our base class. And then, as always, we don't use colon and new lines. We use curly braces to define scopes in JavaScript. So if I have a class of day, all right. So this is the same thing going on here. We have a base class, and then we want to have a child class or a derived class. So extends day is the same thing as passing in day as a base class in Python. All right, and then we talk about the constructor. So again, kind of a fancy word, but all it's doing is it's the first method that's going to get called when this object's created. So in JavaScript, we use the constructor keyword instead of underscore init. It's called constructor in JavaScript. It's just language specific. Just got to know what's going on there. And then here you define your values. So we don't have to pass in a this keyword for JavaScript. So our first item will be task list, and next item will be quotes of the day. All right. And then we need to store these values, just like we're storing it here. We need to store these values somewhere within this class. So usually for that, we can create some values. So in this case, let's create a state object. So I guess this can be empty to start off. So in this case, state is just an empty object right now. So we could add values to it as we want to. So if I do this.state.task list, notice that VS Code kind of smartly added that in there for me. Again, this refers to this instance. So each instance has its own state value. This is a little different, I want to point out, than if I add like a state object here. This is a little different because this is a class level attribute. So this can be shared between all instances. That is not the same for creating a state value here, all right? All right, so to be clear, this is not a class level attribute versus this is a class level attribute. So I want to point out the differences there. All right, so let me comment that out in here. This is a class level attribute versus this is a instance attribute. Okay, so easy to get confused, syntax looks the same, but in this case, the state item only belongs to this particular instance. So if I do task list equals task list, and this dot state dot quotes or quote equals quote of the day. All right, so when I create this instance, I'll go let w equal new Wednesday. And then I need to pass in same values. So I'm just going to copy and paste. All right, so again, constructor, that's just the same thing as a init method in Python. It's automatically going to be called by, I guess, the JavaScript framework or JavaScript language, that when you create a new instance, it's going to call your constructor and assign whatever values you want to some internal data structure. So in this case, we're storing it in state. Questions about constructor here?
So if state in JavaScript isn't a class level attribute, then what is it?
It's an instance attribute. So the state right here, so if I create two Wednesdays, so let's say Wednesday 1 and Wednesday 2, let W2 equal new Wednesday. Well, I don't know what to do on this. I screw this up. All right. Let's just say take a nap and then sleep a lot. Okay, so if I create two instances, this state value is unique for each instance. So I'm not basically replacing the state value with the new task list from Wednesday 2. They each own a copy of their own state value versus in Python, this state value would be shared. So if I want to see this maybe in action, I could do self.state, say something equals hello. Oh, passing something.
Okay, so in JavaScript, do you have to initialize state outside of the constructor, or can that be done inside of the constructor?
State, you can create it in your constructor. So if you want to just create it, yeah, you can create it on the fly. So this state equals that. Yeah, this works too. So normally the reason you'd see
that makes a lot more sense to me.
Okay, normally the reason you might see it outside of the constructor is because you might want to predefine some values. So let's say, you know, we're going with something equals. So in this case, if you want to kind of like hard code or make sure every instance has something defined, maybe I should use a better keyword, but this means you're creating something that has some initial values and then you're adding on to it with the constructor. So some of your challenges, you might see the state declared here, but yeah, you can create the state in here. State equals a new dictionary, but keep in mind, if you do this, it's going to wipe away what you had before. So if you kind of reinitialize this state, this something will no longer exist. So it's up to what you're trying to do. If you're trying to if you don't need an initial state value, then you can just create it in your constructor. Otherwise, you want to create it outside your constructor if you need some initial values in there.
So you can't give it an initial value inside the constructor?
I guess you could. That's a good point. Yeah, you can. I mean, yeah, there's no difference here if you did something like this. It's the same.
Yeah, that's when I first learned it, like React, like a few years ago. That's how we would start every single component inside of the instructor. But
yeah, because that makes way more sense to me.
But you don't necessarily require the instructor if it's a parent component. So if a class was a child component, that's when the constructor might make sense. But I mean, either or, it doesn't matter. It works either way.
Okay, so the key thing I wanted to point out with my previous example here, just so we're clear, again, this is a class level attribute. So in that case, we're passing in new thing. So I'm assigning self.state here, which is created up here on line 7. In Python, if I print out W1 dot, what is it, state something. Let's run this quickly, if you guys can bear with me. So how do I get into here? All right, so I'm going to run Python Wednesday.py. All right, so I got new thing. Why did I get new thing? Was because I created a Wednesday 2 object, and that replaced the previous state value where I had something as my initial value for Wednesday 1. So again, this is a class level attribute so that multiple instances share the same value, and there's only one copy of it. So in this case, I overrode it when I created Wednesday2. So when I print out Wednesday1 dot state and the key of something, my value is new thing. That's what was most recently set. As opposed to JavaScript, again, just to highlight, this is an instance attribute. If I create this and do a console.log of Wednesday1.state something, I guess I move away those changes. So I do this dot state dot something equals just maybe passing something x. Let's say something, and this is new thing. All right, so we're passing it another value. We're assigning it to something. So in this case, if I print out something, it should equal something here because that is tied to this instance. As in this state value is not shared between instances. Each instance has its own copy of state. So I run this with the node Wednesday.js. I got an error. Line 13. This. Must call super. All right, good lesson there. Do I just call? That cleans it up. All right, so we got something printed out here. So the error message I got was you need to call your base class constructor. So this super is going to call the constructor for day. Obviously, there's nothing here, but it needs to kind of go down the chain so that I guess this pointer is set correctly. But yeah, so in this case, I printed out something and I got something from Wednesday1 because whatever I set for Wednesday2, that's its own thing. So if I printed out something, the something value for Wednesday2, I should get new thing instead of something. All right, so that's what I want to just highlight. This is instance level attribute. Don't get confused with Python where you have a class level attribute. All right, so that's all I kind of want to point out there. Any questions?
Yeah, Ankur, I have a question.
Yep.
It's kind of going off what Tom just talked about, where you'd only have a constructor for like child classes.
Yeah.
When we're talking about React, wouldn't like every class that we make be a child class because we're always extending like React component? So wouldn't they always have like a constructor in that case?
They don't need a constructor. So the only time you need a constructor if you need to kind of create some state values dynamically. But if I didn't need to store anything, like if I wasn't passing anything here, you don't need to create a constructor just to call super. It kind of automatically does that for you. So it's what's known as a default constructor. This constructor automatically gets created for you if you leave it empty. So if I left this off, I can just create my state values here if I know what my values are. Right, but if I actually need to like pass something from my when I'm creating the class and pass values there, then you need a constructor kind of initialize those values. So in this case, this will work just fine because I don't have a constructor. So a default constructor kind of auto magically gets created and gets used. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, it makes sense. It kind of seems like it just depends a little bit on how explicit you want to be with it, because I feel like couldn't you still just do it anyway and it wouldn't make a difference, right? You would just like if you always explicitly created the constructor rather than just letting like the compiler make it.
Yeah, you could create it. It's not going to hurt, but it's generally if it's just doing something that's going to be done automatically anyway, it's kind of just unnecessary at that point. All right, so that's again just covering classes in JavaScript versus classes in Python. Just gonna know that you can do essentially the same thing. The syntax can be a little different. Just key thing is use constructor. There we go. Undo my changes here. Yeah, so use a constructor instead of init method. Essentially, they're doing the same thing though, or their task is the same thing.
So do you have to call the super every time?
Yeah, it looks like. So when I try to run it, it says must call super constructor in derived class before accessing this. or returning from derived constructor. So yeah, it seems like you want to call the base class first and then do your additional logic here.
So do you have to pass it any parameters if you have like props or anything?
You do if this constructor took in something. So if I had a constructor, looks like I took away my parameters. So let's say my day constructor required a quote of the day. So if I had quote of the day here, then I need to pass this via the super call. So if I do quote of the day here, and let's say I was storing this over here. So now, yeah, you pass in whatever the base constructor will need, and then you can do whatever else with the values you want. So I did this. What error did I get now? Oh, naming differences. Always hard to go from Python and JavaScript back and forth. Still more errors. Quote of the day not defined. One more instance. More errors. Cannot set properly. Undefined. Oh, so I need to create state. Duh. All right. Third time the charm. There we go. All right, yeah. So in this case, we're passing it down. So our base class matching quote. So that's what you could pass down if your base constructor needs something.
So you also need a empty object for this dot state if you have a constructor for the base class.
Yeah, so this state is going to be different than this state. So if I print out, let's see, how would I do this? So this is not the same as this, I don't believe. So let's see if we could figure this out. If I do console.log, this that's W1.state, what do we get? So we get that. So how do we access the state? It's a good question.
Would it be just state?
It wouldn't be state because it's still an instance attribute on our day. So we create this state. Might have to Google this quickly.
Shouldn't be under Wednesday, would it?
Well, we have Wednesday, so we have our Wednesday one object, but we need to, if we want to access the state from here, the question is, are we overwriting it, or are we, do we have two copies?
Would it be day dot state then?
It would not be day, because again, that is a class. We don't have class level attributes. This refers to an instance. So if we did day, that won't accomplish what we want, I don't think. I guess you could maybe do, I'm going to try this. If it doesn't work, then we'll kind of move on. Day dot call this and state. No, it's not going to work. It only works for function. All right, yeah, I'm not sure how we can access this value directly. I guess if we name it something else, that should work. Call it data, and we should be able to get it here. Data. Now, 32. Undefined. That's not good. Yeah, I'm not sure how to access this data member. Definitely exists.
I mean, isn't it undefined because it's an empty object?
It is, but then we add a quote number to it. Right? Undefined means like it doesn't know what it is, versus if it's empty, that's still something valid. So it should be an
Oh,
empty object.
Would it just come back null then?
What was that?
Would it come back null?
Yeah, if it wasn't assigned to anything, then it would be null. If we're empty, it would still show that empty object. So this and null are different. Null means we explicitly set nothing, versus undefined means it just doesn't know what it is. Empty
Ankur, I
is
have a
different than
question.
null. Yep.
Will we have to import from Wednesday.py?
Import from Wednesday. Oh, sorry, I'm not using Python here.
Sorry, I just got confused. My fault.
Oh no, sorry. Yeah, I have JavaScript on the left side, Python here. So I'm trying to run my JavaScript file, and I'm wondering why this.data is coming back as undefined. So, oh, sorry. Sorry. I forget if someone said that. That's my bad if they did. It should be W1.data, not this. I'm getting confused there. So yep, we get the quote here. So, we can access a base class member just like we do any other member. But the question is, if we name this state, how do we actually access the state from the base class? Because this is basically overwriting it. But I'm pretty sure that this state still exists somehow. You guys kind of get what I'm trying to figure out here?
Would it be day.state? I mean, I have no idea.
We can try it. So if we do day.state, again, day is not an instance, it's a class. So there's not going to be anything with the state. So if I run this, I'm pretty sure it'll be undefined. Yep, undefined. Because this would be looking for a class level attribute.
And what happens if you just do W1.state there?
So if you do W1, it's going to take this state value that exists here on Wednesday, not the state value that I created on day.
What about just Wednesday?
That won't work either, because again, we don't have any class level attributes. So we need instances to get access to this data. That's what this pointer is doing. Okay, if you did want a class level attribute, just go over it. There's a static keyword, and in here you can create some value. So
You could do that within the child class.
do what within the child class?
Make a class level attribute in the child class.
Yep.
With the static keyword.
Yeah, so the static keyword just means this is a class level attribute. It's the same as what I'm doing here. So this would be, it's called this value. I guess that's going to break my code.
So would there be a purpose in doing that in the child class instead of just doing it in the base class?
Yeah. The purpose would be, let's say, I had class weekend extends, or let's call it Thursday extends day. The reason why you may want it in your child class instead of your parent class is just use case. It depends on your design. If Wednesday needs a class level value or attribute, but Thursday does not, then you want to put it in your child class. If both of these days need it, then your base class should have it, because that's what's shared between Thursday and Wednesday. So it comes down to, again, your use cases. If only Wednesday needs some magical value that is, shared between all Wednesdays, then you would want to put that in the specific class that only needs it. You don't want Thursday to get extra functionality that it doesn't need. All right, so again, static is the magic keyword you got to use to create a class level attribute. So if I do this, this dot value dot something equals x, and then, all right, so in this case, we have W1. I think my W2 went away. Let's get that back. All right, so we got to use this new keyword when we're creating instance, take a nap, sleep is good, new thing. All right, so new thing is what I'm setting to this dot value dot something. So let's actually print out W1 dot value. Dot
Do you need a
something
let for that W2?
for that. Yes, I do. Thank you. All right, so now this is a shared attribute. So unlike before, if I print out W1 value dot something, which is this static value, it should be new thing instead of something, because they're both sharing that value. So if I run this, I get more errors. Terrific. Cannot set undefined. Oh, this is where I want to do. I want to say that value dot something. What's going on here? Oh, this doesn't exist. All right, getting many errors here. Value that something. Day, Wednesday. All right, so again, class level attribute, you use the keyword static, and then you would set the value to that class, not to that instance. So again, this is an instance. Wednesday is a class. It's your blueprint. So basically every Wednesday is going to use the same value versus the state is going to be unique to each instance. All right, so again, that's classes in JavaScript. As Tom mentioned, JavaScript wasn't meant to be an OOP language, but they kind of introduced classes more recently so that you can kind of use it as an OOP language. But all right, we'll just leave that there. All right, so let's kind of get back to our new site challenge. So here, again, we have class, we have a constructor that's taking in props. Notice that we're passing down props down to our base class, which is our component. And then we're creating some new variables here. So we have a random article index, random article. It looks like we're just grabbing a random number based on our news data. So if we look at news.json, that's in our data folder. This is just a giant file that has news articles represented as a JSON format. So we have a title, an author created, and then I'm not sure what, these are probably just topics. So we have a whole bunch of data, and basically we're importing this into our app.js as a news, I guess, object, and that's what we're using to basically grab a random number based on the length of the news. Is it a list? Yeah, it's a list. So we have a news, I guess, array in JavaScript. We're just grabbing a random number for an index, and then we're grabbing a random article from that array. All right, so that's what these two values are going to keep track of. And then we have a state that we're creating here. So state's going to have nav items, and for that random article that we got, we're going to store that into an article object where we have ID, title, abstract, and a few other items. Okay, and then we have a render method. Our render method is going to be just showing some data. We have an app nav component we're going to add in. So app nav here. We have an article teaser, and then we're going to implement an article. So let's actually see what this looks like. To get this running, I'm going to do npm start. Got an error. Oh, I'm not in the correct directory. Always gets me. So if I cd into news site one, do npm start now. All right, server's booting up. There it is. It's coming. It's taking its time.
Load faster.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's taking this long. I don't think I don't have a breakpoint here. All right, I think it should be up now. All right, so this is what you should see when you launch the project. Again, we haven't made any changes at this point. We just have article teaser, article, and app nav. So if we go back to our challenge, which is our main goal here, first thing is we want to implement article teaser. So let's kind of read what we need to do. The article teaser component should accept the following props. We have ID, title, created date, and handle title click, and event handling function. All right, so given that, app.js is our parent. So this is our parent component that owns It's going to render app nav article teaser. So again, we're passing in an article ID, title, created date, and handle title click. So it looks like that's already done for us. In this case, our handler is simply going to take an article ID and log that out to our console right now. All right, so if we actually go to article teaser, let's take a look at that. So right now, article teaser, it's not doing anything. It's just returning an empty div, so we're not actually seeing anything. But we want to actually implement that. So let's actually see what we need to display. Display the title in an A tag. So I'm just going to copy this to make it easier, so I don't have to go back and forth. Copy our requirements for article teaser. Let's add that as a comment here. So one, we need to display one title, that's 2, and 3. All right, so 3 objectives for article teaser. Display the title inside of an A tag. So let's do that here. I'm gonna put A. How do I actually grab the title here? Anyone?
I think you need this dot props dot article dot title. Is that what you're asking?
Yep, you're right, because this title comes from what we're passing. The parent is passing down a prop of title, so we have access to title in our child component. What am I missing here?
Curly braces.
Yep, you guys got it. So anytime you're writing just pure JavaScript instead of JSX, you want to use curly brackets. So in this case, this will be identified as JavaScript. So this, again, is the instance of article teaser that we're working with. Props is automatically kind of just passed down to your component. And then title is the prop that we actually want to display here. So again, the props was passed via the constructor, but we don't have a constructor here. The reason being is because we have that default constructor that accepts props and passes it down to the base class and does everything it needs to for this props to kind of exist for us. All right, so this props.title should show us the title. This when the title A tag is clicked, it should call this props.handle title click with the ID. So let's do that. So it looks like we need an onClick method here, or onClick events, and that's going to call this props.handle. Just copy this so I don't mistype it. And we'll try to click. All right, but it should call it with an ID. How do we actually pass an ID to this function? Anyone have thoughts here?
You just do it inside of a brace with this stuff. Oh no, you do it with a prop itself, right? Where we'd say like ID equals to this props.
Say that again, Jack. Sorry.
I have about halfway through the first thought, but would you pass it as a prop where you'd have like ID is equal to this props dot?
Pass it as a prop. No, not quite. So we want to call a function here. This handle title click. If we go back to our parent, this is the function that we passed it. So this is going to take in an article ID and simply write out that article ID to our console. So the question is, how do we actually pass an article ID value here? When we click this title, we want to call this function, but we need to pass it an ID, this.props.id. So I guess the question I was asking was, we want to do this, but why can't we just pass it like this? Anyone know why?
No idea.
So when you
That's gonna call the function instead of passing the function call to the JavaScript, isn't it?
Yep, I think Sean said it. Sorry, say that again, Sean.
It's gonna call the function instead of passing the function as a so that it's gonna call it right away instead of calling it when you click.
Yep, it's a very important point that Sean said correctly. If you add parentheses to a function call, it's going to call it right away. So even if we weren't passing a value, if we had parentheses here, we're actually calling this function at this point, which is not what we want. We only want this function to be called when the onClick event happens. So we need to just pass it a function pointer instead of calling the function. So adding parentheses is invoking the function. So you might hear that terminology. This means we're invoking it, which means we're calling it right away. That is not what we want here. So how can we alleviate this? Anyone have any ideas?
return, maybe? I don't know.
Need to write it using fat arrow notation.
Yep, Sean's got it. So if we add this, now we're creating a function, an anonymous function here, so that whenever this is called, it's going to call this function for us. There are two ways to go about this. If this looks kind of messy to you, you just create an intermediary function. So instead of doing that, I could just do something handle click, and that could be my new function. Again, it's just component is the same thing. So I could create handle click here, and inside my handle click, I could just simply call this props handle title click. Again, that's coming from our props, and then pass it the ID. So instead of doing an anonymous function here, I could just do this handle click. Right. So it's both the things I just did are the same exact thing. In this case, I created a function up here, and this is an anonymous function. So handle click is equal to this function here. And then for my on click handler, I just say, all right, handle click will, resolve this event. In this case, handle click is just going to call this props handle title click, which is our main goal here. So again, instead of doing this, you could just cut out the middleman and create the anonymous function right inside of your on click here. Does that make sense? I want to make sure that everyone's clear on why we can't just, how did I screw this up? Not sure what I miscopied. Oh, sorry, I didn't copy it properly. Yeah, so again, this, I'll go right here. Okay, that goes there. And then I don't need these curly braces because we only have one line. So in this case, we're just creating an anonymous function here that will be triggered when on-click happens. So I don't need this middleman here. Everyone clear on why you want to use that arrow instead of just calling this function directly? Like right here. Please ask questions if that's still kind of unclear to anyone.
I'm still kind of lost.
Okay, absolutely. So let's just back up and just talk about this. So again, if you just had it like this is going to call this function immediately. That's not what we want, right? So like when we have a function x, if I have x with parentheses here, it's going to actually call this function. I don't want to call this function right now. I want to pass a pointer to that function so that whenever on-click happens, it will call this function for me. So leaving off the parentheses is doing two different things. So if you have x alone, this is going to be a pointer or a reference to a function versus this is calling the function right away. All right, so here we don't want to call this function at this moment in time. As in when this is rendered, we don't want this function to be called.
So that function is only console logging the ID.
Yep. Let's actually take a look at this. So if I clear this, all right. So I accomplished two. I'll come back to this point. So I'm going to add that there and display the created date in a p tag. So let's take care of that third item. So we need a p tag, and that's going to be curly braces. This props created date should be our prop created date. All right, so let's take a look at, I'm going to save this and see do we have any errors. The href attribute is required for anchor. I think that's just a warning. So usually when you have warnings, you want to just at least give them a good read. It's not going to mean that there's an error. So if I run this, notice that we get our title here. So we're not, I think this is Latin or some other language, but then we have a created date and the title here. Okay, so what I want to do here. This has a warning, so let's actually take care of that. I think we just want some href. Will that take care of it? All right, now it's a title. Okay, I'm going to bring up my property inspector and bring up my console. So I'm on my console here. So if I click this, that's not what I want. I'll do hashtag. Refresh. All right, so now when I click this, notice I get the ID printed out here. So I get 22. Right, so that's the article ID. If I refresh this page, I should get nothing. So there's nothing in my console here. If I click this, I get 38 because that's the random ID that the random function kind of generated for us. All right, so every time I click, I'm kind of each time printing out to console, it's accumulating in here. So I've clicked it 15 times, clicked it 20 times here. All right, so the question is, what if we took away this anonymous function and just had the function call here? What's going to happen if I save that? Let me refresh my page. Notice I get a printout right away. I didn't even click on this title, but the console printed out what that function was doing. So if I click this now, notice that nothing happens. The reason is because I didn't pass a function pointer to the onClick handler. I actually just called a function. So that's the difference. Again, if you don't create an anonymous function here and you kind of have these parentheses for whatever function is here, it's going to execute it one time. So again, if I refresh my page, boom, and it executed that function, because when it processed that line of code, it called that function for me. And so that's why I got a 4 printed out here. But now, anytime I click this, notice that I'm not accumulating any more printouts here. The reason being is because I didn't give this a function pointer to call. So now when I call onClick, it doesn't have a function to call. That's why we want to create an anonymous function, so that now this is a function pointer that when this is clicked, it's going to call this function for us. Again, to make this more clear, I could create a handle click function like I did before, and then this is going to be an anonymous function. And instead of putting this here, I could just say this dot handle click. And now again, I'm passing a function pointer to onClick, so that when onClick is actually, when that event happens, JavaScript will actually call this function for me. And this function will do what we're doing before, which is this dot props. Let me just copy from our comment here. All right, so now when we click on this title, this function will be called for us as opposed to us calling the function right away. Stephen, I know you asked that question. Does that make any more sense, or are we still a little confused here?
Still a little confused.
Okay, what are you confused about?
Let's see. Browser. Never mind.
You sure? All right, if you have a question asked later, we can come back to it. But yeah, so again, this is calling a function. This dot props handle title click is another function that we actually created. So that's this function over here. So we're passing
the two. Go ahead.
Or we're passing props. In this case, ID, title, and created date. Those are just values we're passing. But we can also pass other items such as a function pointer as a prop also. So that's what's being done here. Handle title click. The value we're giving is a function pointer, so that we can call that from our child class if we need to. And this is the usual way that you design so that child components can pass values back to a parent component if you need to. Yeah.
Of the two ways of doing it with the anonymous function, like in the onClick part of your a tag, or having it as a like helper function inside of the article teaser, which is like the preferred, or is it sort of like dealer's choice again?
I'd say probably dealer's choice. I personally prefer this because it's easier for me to kind of just parse it. Like, hey, I'm calling this function, or this function will be called, and I look at that function, and it's kind of organized a little bit more. Like this, line of code isn't too long, but if we had like a longer line of code or more lines of code to call, like we need to do more stuff here, like this state, and we need to update state or set state. Like if we had more to do, I think it just makes sense to have a function. So I just create that function anyway, unless it's like a super simple call. Yeah, I'd say I'm not sure I'd do something 100% of the time. So I think both are appropriate. It just comes down to what you prefer, I guess.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep. I mean, this adds more lines of code, and it's like kind of unnecessary because again, this is just a simple function call. But yeah, it's up to you. Okay, so that takes care of article teaser. I think we probably should take a break. I don't want to go too long without taking a break. So let's take another 9-minute break. So it's 10:21 here. Let me pause the recording. All right, so we're tackling news site 1, and we completed our article teaser. So our objectives were display the title and A tag, display it when clicked, it should print out the ID to the console, and we want to display the created date. So we got something that looks like this. And when we click on our title, we should get the ID of the article print out to our console down below. All right, so that was part 1 of our task. So let's actually, incrementally commit. Always good to do that. So I'm going to bring up a new window. I'm going to do a git add everything, git git commit -m completed part 1. All right, so that's saved into Git. All right, let's continue on with article. So what do we need to do with article? Again, this is a class-based component. There's nothing special going on here. Right now, we're just returning an empty div, but we want to add some logic there. So if we go down to article, in app.js, there'll be article component. We pass it article ... or ... article. Rather than passing the entire article object, we spread it out. All right, so we're passing title, create date, abstract, byline, and image. The first 4 values will always be there. Image and byline might not be set. I'm not sure why byline is mentioned here. Oh, there it is, optional. All right, sorry, the first 3 items will be guaranteed. The next 2 will be optional. And then we want to display these things. So I'm going to copy this over again and add those as comments. So 1, do that, 2, do that. All right, so one point that I don't want to gloss over is let's go back to our app.js. We mentioned this in the curriculum page or the write-up, but here we're doing something called using the spread operator. So we have this article object. So if we go back up, notice that article is coming from our state. So we have an article object here. We're passing that down to our article, but we're using the spread operator. So what the spread operator is essentially doing is it's taking this object and breaking it apart. So instead of having everything bundled together, we're just going to have the key value pairs kind of tied together separately. So ID will be set to random article index, and then title will be sent to random article title. But the way it's done here, this is the same thing as doing ID equals random article index, where value is set here. All right, so it's going to break apart that object and basically set it to something that looks like this. So we're passing down props so that ID will be a prop. Likewise, title will be a prop, abstract will be a prop. That'll be the prop name, and then the value will be the value tied to it inside this object. So that's what the spread operator is doing. Instead of us manually having to like kind of pick apart all the values of our object, we can just simply, instead of doing this, we just use a spread operator and spread apart the object. This is very similar to like quards in Python, where we had, the keyword and then set the equal to a value. That's essentially what we're getting out of this spread operator. Okay, so we're passing those values down to article. We have a few items we want to do here. Sorry, one moment. Ambulance going down my street. All right, so we have 5 things we want to do for the article component. First is display the title inside of an H1 tag. That should be simple enough. So I'm going to add an H1 tag. And then again, we have props that we have access to. So it's going to be this.props because we're in a class-based component. And then we want to access the title. Again, this title is coming from the title right here. Those names have a match. So our object had a title in it. When we spread it apart down here, we're getting something that looks like title equals, whatever. That's where this title prop is coming from.
Would you also be able to access it with this props.article.title?
No, good question, but article is not a prop that we're passing down. So there's nothing that we've passed that's article equals, I guess, this dot state dot, where are we? I guess we have article here. There's nothing, we're not passing down an article component, or sorry, an article prop. So yeah, our child does not have access to anything called article. We could, like, that'd be an alternative. If we wanted to pass this entire object down, we could pass that as a prop. But in that case, we're passing kind of a reference copy, and we don't necessarily want to be able to update this with our child component.
So this is like keyword arguments?
Yep, yeah, so the spread operator is going to convert the article object into, it's not modifying the article object, it's going to just break that, create a copy of all the values. So we're going to have ID equals this, title equals that, and again, these are all going to be separate values when we use the spread operator here. All right, so that's going to be what our article has access to. So this.props.title is one of the values that was kind of spread apart from the object. So there's nothing, I think Reno's question was, do we have this.props.article? And the answer is no. That is not a prop that we pass down. All right, so we have an H1 tag, created date should go in a paragraph tag. So let's do that. This.props.created date. What else we got to do here? Byline, if it exists, in an H2 tag. So this is where we can conditionally render something. So if you want to do something like this, we could say this.props.byline. Does that exist? If so, we want to show an H2 tag with this.props.byline in curly braces. Or if it doesn't exist, we could just do null. Another way to do this would be we just do this and that, I believe. Okay, so now this is saying if this is something valid, so this is a non-null value, we want to show it in an H2 tag, otherwise render nothing for this chunk of code. That's what's being done here. We want to do the same for our image tag. So we'll copy this, put this here. We'll do this prop.image.
Would it make sense to destructure the props here?
You could. I think that's what we did in the app.js. So what James is asking, should we, break apart the state so that we just have the values like this? So we're basically picking out whatever values we want. So we could do that, yes. So if we want to do that, we do something like const and then the value. So we do title and created date and etc. from this.props. So this is what I think what James is asking. Yeah, you could do this if that makes it easier. Instead of writing this.props over and over, you could totally do this, and I probably will clean up your code. Let's just do that. I usually don't, but I don't have a good reason why I don't. Mostly because I don't know. I don't find it annoying to write this.props, but create date, byline. So we have image. I just need to double check here. So we had ID, title, abstract, byline, image, and created date. So let's copy those over. So we have ID, title, abstracts. Then we had byline, image, and created date. So the last two here are not guaranteed. So as in they might be null. So that's why we were checking here. So image, we want an image tag. So image mg src equals the image. And that's going to be a self-closing tag. Or we want to show null. And then what else? Abstract. Let's see, byline. Yep, and display the abstract inside of a p tag. So that's the last thing to do. So we'll do that here. P paragraph tag, and then this dot props. Oh, we have abstract here. All right. So again, since we destructured it, we can just use these values as such. So let me take away all these dot props to clean up a bit. Create a date, byline, and image. All right, so let's take a look at this. We might have errors, but that's why we kind of code a little bit and then check. All right, so I think I accomplished these 5 items from our task list. Let's actually see if this works. So I'm going to need to, yeah, okay. So let me get rid of my console here. All right, notice we have an article here. There's no image, so there's no image. Let's try refreshing and see if one of our random articles has an image. So refresh. Yeah, it looks like my image is not actually working. So this is going to require some debugging. The question is, why isn't our image working? So if I actually go back to my data, let's take a look at what our data is actually formatted. So, this is an article. We have multimedia, image. So I think we need URL. So image is another object, I think. So let's take a look at app.js. Image is taking the article, looking at the multimedia section, and then assuming that it has something that's non-zero, it's grabbing the first multimedia item, and I guess it is grabbing the URL. So I guess in this case, we have a URL. Yeah, not sure why we're not rendering anything. Let's see.
Maybe it's not active to what it's called.
I think that image was just broken. So I refreshed again. I got another image that looks like it's working. So I keep refreshing. A lot of these have images. If they don't, then we shouldn't show anything. So again, if we look at our property inspector, we can actually see the source of our code. Elements. I guess we won't be able to see that here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is what we rendered. So notice that we don't have an image tag here because we left it off because there's no image, right? That's what our conditional rendering is doing. So here in our article component, we are conditionally rendering something. If the image exists, then we actually introduce an image tag. Otherwise, nothing is being rendered here. So this null is just saying don't render anything here. Like the alternative would be we could have like an empty image tag that shows nothing, but we don't want to just have empty elements if they're not going to do anything for us. So if I refresh my page, I gotta dig down again. In this case, we did have an image, so we have an image attribute here, but yeah, so again, it's kind of hard to see both of these, but we do have an image down here. All right, so I guess the takeaway from this is understand what the spread operator is doing. Here, we're taking an object using the spread operator to get particular values out of it, and then those are passed down as props, and then we can, break apart, destructure the props we want to, just have easier access. This is the same thing as doing this props.title. If I didn't have this line here, then I would have to access the title through this props. Okay, so looking at this isn't too messy, but I might want to break this out into a function just so I don't have like that much JavaScript here. So I might, optionally, not required, I could do get byline and maybe do this outside of render. I need to fix my tabbing here. Get byline. And then this would simply do what I'm doing here. So I could do something like return And that should work. And likewise for my image, I'll do get image. And here I want to call get byline or this dot get byline. All right, so this kind of cleans up my code, I think. Again, totally optional, but less lines in our render. So paragraph and this image needs to be pulled out. So we had this dot get image. All right, so there's my render method. And really get my tabbing fixed here. Okay, and then this should return the same thing. So image, and we had an image tag here.
Do you have to make
Encore,
this-
do you mind slowing down a bit? You're going way too fast.
Sure.
Do you have to make those functions above the render method, or can you do it under it?
You could nest these functions inside the render method. Yeah, like there's nothing stopping you from having functions within functions. I don't prefer that just because it gets like if you have functions within functions, your tabbing kind of gets very indented and kind of makes it harder to read each function. So yeah, sorry, I will slow down. So basically what I did here was I created some functions within my class. And the purpose of that was so that I can make my render method a little easier to visually parse. So that now I'm calling this .get byline. And that's just going to return, if something exists, it's going to return this attribute or this element. All right, so I did change my logic here. I'm using this and to end. What this is basically doing is saying, hey, if this is null, then this and is not going to be evaluated. This goes back to how logical operators work. So for ands, both sides had to be true. So your compiler or whatever is running your code is smart enough to know, like, if one side is evaluated to false, it does not need to check the second side. So in this case, if this is null, we're just going to return null. However, if this is something that is not null, then it's going to proceed to do the second part of the and it's going to actually return the H2 tag. So you might see this again. Previously, I was using a ternary operator with a question mark and colon. This is just another, I guess, sort of quicker way to do that, because if both of these are like, if this is null, then it's going to return null right away.
Ankur, when we include functions, does it matter if they're before or after where we call them in React?
Good question. Functions should be hoistable. Classes are not hoistable, but functions should be. So if I think the question was, what if I move this down below my render? I believe that should work, but as always, it doesn't hurt to check instead of assume. So I'm going to move that below my render. So again, my render is simply printing out the values. I'm calling a couple functions because that's going to be some conditional rendering. So I just wanted the logic kind of separated out. And then if I save this, and let's see if React run byline not defined, image not defined. Oh, so I don't have access to this. This props byline, and this props image. The reason I need this props here is because I destructured my the item here. Okay, so if I run this, let's see if we have any errors. Nope, looks like this is working now. So I refresh. Looks like it's still working.
You could have destructured the props outside of the render, and then that would have worked fine for the function also.
Let's see if that's true. So if I pull this out, will that work? Doesn't look like it likes it. So I don't think we can do that here. Also, I'm missing something. I just do this here. No, I don't think you can do that outside of a function.
That's not very nice.
Yeah, I mean, there might be a way to do it. Like maybe you could have a constructor and then pull out those values into local variables, as that could be something you could do. But yeah, I don't know. So if you did want to have like just named values, again, you'd create a constructor and have this line in your constructor so that you could do a this.id instead of doing this.props.id, but you're not really getting too much there then.
Gaining a lot of clutter.
I guess, yeah. All right, any questions about our article component? My console here. All right, so that takes care of our article component. Last thing we need to do, I guess before I proceed, let me do an incremental commit. So do git add everything, git commit -m completed part 2. All right, cool. And let's look at our app nav and see what we need to do here. So app nav, notice they talk about conditional rendering. So if you guys are reading the curriculum page, they'll talk about the 2 options I went with. One was using the and operator, or the second was using a ternary, which is what's done down here. I guess there's 3 options. Create a help or render function. I guess that's kind of what I did also. So again, you do have options. It's kind of what you think is the least clutterish, the least, I guess, ugliest in terms of your evaluation. I usually like creating extra functions just because I don't want like my render method having like too much logic kind of baked into it. I'd rather just have some functions to break apart that logic, but totally up to you. So you have option 1, use the and operator. Option 2, create a helper function. Option 3, use a ternary. Dealer's choice as always. All right, so let's go down to app nav. App nav component should accept the following props. We need something called nav items and a handle nav click function. App nav component should return a nav component that contains an a tag as children, one for every item in the nav items list. The app nav component should map through the stop props nav items, create a tag elements. Okay, seems like we can do that. So I'm gonna go over to my coding window. Let's look at app nav. All right, so again, app nav is stubbed out, but there's no logic in it. That's our task, is to add logic. Looking at our app.js, we have app nav. We're passing nav items. Nav items, if we take a look at it, is nav items. What is that? Nav items is coming from our data file. So if we look at our data files, there should be nav items.json. If you click on that, you kind of see what the structure looks like. So this is a list of objects, and each object has a label and a value key with appropriate values assigned to them. All right, so that's what our structure looks like. It's a list, or sorry, an array. I keep saying Python terminology. It's an array in JavaScript. So we're importing that as nav items, and then we're setting that simply equal to our state value for nav items. Okay, and then we're destructuring our state and then passing the nav items down to our app nav. And also we have a function, anonymous function we're creating here. When we click on a nav item, we should console log the clicked item. So similar to what we did with our article teaser. So let's take a look at app nav and let's see what we have to do here. Map through, I think that's the only thing we need to do here. Copy this, add a comment. Says map through this props.nav items, create an array of anchor tag elements, and the object within this props will look something like that. Yep, we verified that. When mapping the nav item objects into an a tags, you'll want to use the label property displayed in the above example as a text, and then you want to use the value. Let's see. So the label is the text, the value is what we pass to handle nav click. All right, let's keep that in mind. So maybe comment that out here. Value label is the text to show, and value is value to pass to the handler function. Okay, so given that, let's render some stuff. So since I know I'm gonna do some additional stuff and just show like some data, I'm just gonna create a function. So I'm gonna call it this dot, let's say render nav items. And now I need to create this function. So I'm gonna create above. I need to fix my tabbing for JavaScript. Looks like I'm using 4 instead of 2 spaces. So then I create a function called render nav items. That's going to be an anonymous function or a fat arrow function. again, anonymous function, fat arrow function, same thing. And here we want to map through this.props.nav items. So hopefully you guys remember your array methods from JavaScript. So map is one of them. Let me ask the audience because I feel like I haven't talked to you guys. Who haven't I heard from today? Let's go with Eric Berger. Can you kind of describe what the map function is going to do for me, if you remember? And if not, totally fine.
I do not.
Right, that's all right. Let's see, who else do we have here? Vincent, would you be able to describe what the map array function is doing here? Or is going to do for us?
Yes, we kind of used this a little bit yesterday. I think it's kind of, in this case, it's mapping out that individual state. So I don't know, having trouble describing it kind of in comparing it to how we used it yesterday though.
Okay. Yeah. So again, it's just it's a really handy function. So I'd encourage all of you guys, if you're not familiar with map or filter or reduce in JavaScript, please Google them, as you're going to be using them probably a lot in React. So map is one array function that what it's going to do is it's going to go through this array. In this case, nav items is our array. It's going to go through each element. So we're going to pass an element here. So I'm going to call it item. And then also, you can also capture the index. So these are going to be your two inputs to an anonymous function here. This is what map, again, is automatically going to pass an item and index for each value that it goes through for nav items. Then we're going to create an anonymous function here. And we want to do something with one or both of these inputs. So in this case, we want to return an A tag. And then again, just going through our requirements here, we want to create an array of A elements. So what this is going to do, anything you return from here, it's going to add that to a new array. It's not this array, nav item, is not going to be modified by map. So we're going to actually create a new, let's call it elements. This is going to be a brand new array that is going to have the same number of indices as nav items, but it's going to be what we're returning here. So we're using nav items, grabbing the item at each indice or each index, and then we're going to do something with that index. So in this case, we're going to return an A tag, but we want to actually have some text here. So our text is the label. So if we do item.label.
Hey, I'll grab a question.
Yep.
Wouldn't map in this case be similar to for each method?
Yeah. Yep. For each, if you're familiar with for each, yeah, those are essentially equal. I think for each might have some different inputs. Might only give you the item. I don't know if it gives you the index also. I might not be sure on that. But yeah, for each is essentially similar to map. All right, so we're looping through nav items one by one. So first time we're going through it, this is going to be the first item in the list. The index would be 0, so that we are 0 based. Here we get an item. We want to take the label. Where's this label coming from, you might ask? Well, if we look at our data, our data here, we have a label. We also have a value. So this is item in my map function. Item, what I called item here, is this entire object. And then I'm getting label out of it. So I'm calling label, and it should give me the value here. So again, if I go back to my code, I can find it at nav. This item is what I highlighted in my nav items here. Item is equivalent to what I've highlighted here, because this list, this entire list, is what nav items is. So nav items here is this entire list. Now we're doing a map function, or as I forget who mentioned, but it's essentially like going through doing a for loop or a for each. So each item is each one of these, and then I'm doing dot label to get the particular item out of it. And then for our, what is it, href? Or is it on click? On click. All right, so we're gonna have an on click handler here. Click, and we're gonna do the same thing we did before. If you remember, we wanna call our handler, or let's see, this dot props dot handle click was it? Gotta double check. So we go back to app.js. Handle nav click is the prop we passed down. So again, we need to match this name. So I'm going to copy this. Handle nav click is our handler. So I go back to app nav. And then I want to call that here. All right, handle nav click is the handler there, but we need to pass it something, right? We need to pass it the value. So just like we did with our article teaser, if I put in value here, or item.value, if I pass in item.value, this function is going to get called right away when this element gets created. That's not what I want. I want this to be an anonymous function so that when they click, only then will this function be called. That's what this is doing for us. This is making this a function pointer so that when this event happens, when the user clicks on this title, then we'll call this function with the appropriate value that we care about. All right, so again, this return statement for each element, it's going to return a new element here, and we're going to store that into, sorry, I got lost here. Oh, elements here. So we have our elements array here. Each of these returns will populate elements with a new index, and then we simply want to return elements out of here. You guys with me here? Again, knowing map is probably most of the battle here. So if this syntax looks kind of foreign to you, or you're kind of, kind of wondering what's going on here, definitely ask questions or Google it. Again, map is definitely very handy. So it should be in your toolbox for React, because you're gonna see it often, you're gonna use it often. Or you should
What's
be.
the index getting used for?
Good question. So I'm glad you asked that, Sarah. Let's actually try running this. Right now, we're not using index. So I don't know if you guys can notice, it's kind of grayed out on my screen, which means VS Code is telling me, hey, this parameter is not actually being used. So we could, we could drop it if we wanted to, but I'm going to keep it there because let's try run React. So notice I got some warnings in my terminal here. So let's take a look at some of those. href attribute is required. So let's make that happy. So we'll add an href here. All right, and there. All right, so this wants an href, so we'll just give it an href to make it happy. Href will be hashtag, which means it's not going to navigate to anywhere. Okay, so that should take care of that warning. What else? ID is assigned a value but never used. I think that was in our article because we broke apart that props, so I'm just going to ignore those. And then we get another href. Let's save this and see what happens. Line 12. What is this? Article teaser, line 11. Not sure what it's complaining about here. Oh, line 19. I have an href. All right, I'm going to ignore these warnings. It's just not liking that I'm not using a proper href with my a tags, and these are fine. So again, always good to read your warnings. Doesn't mean your program is going to break, but it might. So you want to make sure you're doing stuff correctly. All right, so where was I? I was in fnav. Yeah, we're not using this index, so we could probably leave it up and save it. Should be good.
Where are item.value and item.label coming from?
Great question. So if we go back to our data is coming from nav items. The label and value is what I'm referencing. So each item, this is an item in my map function, and item.label is going to give me home in caps, and then item.value should give me home in lowercase. So I'm matching the names here to what I'm using here. Item.label and item.value. Because nav items is a list of objects. Each one of those objects is what I'm calling item. Again, I can call this whatever I want. I can call it OBJ or data or whatever I want to call it. In this case, I chose item. And then I'm accessing the value and the label keys here so that I get the values out of that object.
Wait, how does it know to read from the file?
Good question. So let's take it step by step. So if I go back to my app.js, we are importing that JSON straight into a JavaScript object. The reason we can do this is because JSON is kind of a JavaScript format. So if we have a JSON formatted file and we import from it, this is now going to be a JavaScript array. So again, looking at our data, we have an array, the square brackets here. Each item inside of that array is an object. That's what these curly braces are. So we import that into app.js. So nav items is an array of objects. And then we pass that down to our app nav here. So now we have that array of objects in app nav. We're going to iterate through each one of those objects and then use that, the label and the value to create our anchor tag. Okay, let's actually see if this works. So I'm going to save this. Let's go here, refresh. All right, notice we got this. This says home, opinion, world, national, but it's kind of bunched up, not very easy to read. So I'm actually going to change my formatting a little bit. Let's add some spacing. So for my app label, let's add some spaces. You guys remember in HTML, you can't just simply add spaces. You need to use no break spaces. Just quirk of HTML. So if I add a bunch of spaces here, maybe a pipe, let's see how that looks. All right, so now it's kind of spaced out. Maybe you want to add more spaces after the pipe. Copy, paste. All right, so if I save that, again, these are just spaces in HTML. So now I have something
You've got a pipe in there you don't need.
Yeah, you're right. At the very end, I have a pipe. I could get fancier and get rid of this pipe, but I just want to break this apart. All right, so now this is my nav component. So if I bring up my property inspector, there you are. Let's get you down a little bit with the console. Okay, this is an error I was expecting to see in my terminal, but it looks like it's here. So that is something I will address. But right now, if I click on one of these, that should show the value in lowercase. So if I click on national, notice I get national printed here. If I click on upshot, I click on NY region, world. All right, so seems like my app nav is working correctly. But one thing I want to highlight is this warning here. Again, warnings don't necessarily mean, hey, your program is broken, but it's likely pointing to something that you might want to take a look at. So this is something you will probably see often, and you just gotta be wary of it. So in this case, if you guys can read it, oops, it says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Where this is coming from is app nav, and I guess it doesn't tell me a line number, but I can tell you what line number it is this line right here. All right, this is just something to keep in mind with React. React wants to know, kind of have an identifier for each element that you have. So in this case, we had index here. I'm going to use that index as a key. If I add key equals index, or one click, href. Okay, so we added a key. This will probably require some more reading documentation, but essentially what a key is doing, this is used by React. This is not used by HTML. This key property or attribute is going to allow React to kind of identify each of these anchor tags that you're creating, so that if one of them changes, it does not need to re-render the whole list. It's just going to re-render that item. So now that each of my anchor tags has a unique key tied to it, maybe I want to make this, string key value. Let's say nav. All right, so this is going to be my key. The reason, again, that React kind of prefers this, again, it's still going to work, but React wants to know what identifier for each of your elements, so that, again, if this particular, like one particular element changed, like let's say the title changed for one of them, it could re-render just that particular item instead of re-rendering all the anchor links. Does that make sense? So again, let's say politics, let's say the title of politics needs to change, like through some mechanic, like maybe a user can enter categories or they can update category names. If they change politics, React wants to be able to only update this part of your page instead of re-rendering this entire or updating this entire component. All right, so if you give each one of these elements a unique key, React can say, all right, I'm matching this key and checking, hey, what is the key previously? Or sorry, what is the value of this key previously? And what is the new value? If they don't match, it'll update that particular element on your page instead of the entire component. All right, so that's what this warning was. Now that I fixed it, that warning should go away. So let's verify that. So I've added this key. I'm using that index as my unique identifier so that I could give it a unique key value. You don't want to duplicate key values. So if I do that, let's see. Yep, no errors here. I can still click on these and get those items. All right, so that I think that takes care of our app nav. Let's double check, see if we need to do anything else. We did this, passive value. You are done with all, when your data is displayed and you're on click, events are firing. Yep. Looks like that's a check. So I'm going to do a quick git commit. Bash window, git add that. All right, any questions about anything we did here? Please ask.
Sure, I have some, but I'm gonna rewatch the video when it gets loaded tonight and kind of follow
Okay, yeah, I
along.
mean, you guys are going to be doing this challenge as your daily or your evening challenge tonight. So yeah, the video should be up by hopefully early afternoon. But you're going to be doing the same thing. So I would say try to do it yourself. If you get stuck, definitely reference the video. But kind of want to get you guys, making sure you're comfortable with React enough to kind of follow the directions we have on the page and kind of make the React project from there.
Let me see if I get this straight with the map function. That first parameter references the current element of the array.
Yep.
Is that right?
That's correct.
So that's why it has access to all the properties and nav items.
Yep. So
Okay.
the first iteration is, yep.
I thought it was something being passed in from somewhere else. I'm like, where is this item coming from?
Oh, sorry. No, yeah. So those parameters, sorry, where were we? Article or nav items. Yeah, these parameters are being passed by this map function. So this map function is going to pass an object, or sorry, an element from your list. So it's going through this list. It's basically doing a for loop. So if we want to write this a different way, just so it's clear, we could do that. So we did a for item of, or my syntax, let item of this, that property. All right, so this is the same thing. If we do a let of item and then wanted to return, let's say we let elements equal an empty list, and then we populate elements here. We push some values to it. In this case, it'll be the same thing. That looks kind of gross, but it works. Tab everything, so we're good. Okay, so this is the same thing. Map is doing essentially this. It's doing a for loop, grabbing an item for each of these items, and then pushing. The push is coming from the assignment here. So every return value is essentially a push into your array.
And it's an enumerate because you get the index back too.
Good question. I know you could do that in Python. I'm not sure. There's probably a way to do it in JavaScript. I don't remember offhand how to get index and elements.
Probably just increment a variable each time.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, that was my initial thing. I'm looking online and okay, the for each function. So someone mentioned the for each function. That is essentially like map, but so you could do it with for each. Looks like you could do it with entries. So if you did this dot entries like that, then you should be able to get an item and index that item. I think this should work.
I think that would pull the key in the value.
Key and value. There's no key in, so this is a list. So if you do entries.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm thinking objects.
Yep. Yeah, so this should give you back an index and item and work the same as your map function. So again, you can use for loops, but I'd highly recommend getting comfortable with maps. So I know from my personal experience, the first time I saw a ternary operator, I was like, whoa, I don't know what's going on here. It's hard for me to read. I was like, I don't want to use ternary operators. I would just use if statements because they accomplish the same thing. But eventually I became comfortable with ternary operators, and they're super handy for making your code much more easy to read once you get familiar with them.
Yeah, it's just trying to wrap my head around the syntax of map, like what sort of error you would get if you didn't put a function after map.
Yep, you need to provide a function. So in this case, we have an anonymous function. If you wanted to clean this up a little bit more, you could create a new function here that takes in item index. Let's just say map this. Again, there's many ways to do it. So you just have a function here, and then this blob here. And then instead of having the anonymous function here, you just call map this here. All right, same thing. You have a function.
That's so weird.
You can even do it with the dot reduce if you want to be fancy with it.
So yeah, you create a function and then pass that function pointer to your map function. Either way, there's many ways to do it. It's up to you what you think is best. All right, so that takes care of our class-based component. If you saw at the very bottom, now make it functional. So this is something we should get comfortable with. Again, functional components are the way we're going to get doing most of our items. So we want to convert everything we've done here to a functional-based component. So that'll be our next task. But before we get into that, let's take a quick break. So 11:17 here.
But on line 24 of that you're in right there, that can you just go over what that's doing again?
Yeah, so this is again something specific that React is looking for. It wants to be able to identify each of these elements individually. And so React uses key. This is similar to in HTML where we have ID equals, whatever. React uses key. I'm not sure, again, this might require some further investigation or reading documentation, but essentially React wants some way to uniquely identify each particular element, because we're creating a list here, right? We're mapping through our initial data and then we're creating a list of elements, and we're returning a list of elements that a bunch of A tags essentially. This key allows React to say, okay, I can uniquely identify each one of these elements. So if I can select one like business, this is one A tag. If this ever updates through whatever means, like the user updates it or something in the logic changes the title of this or changes some attribute of this element, React will then only update this element instead of updating this entire component. It's still going to work, but it's less efficient. So React, again, part of the beauty of React is that it only updates the screen on what has changed. It doesn't refresh the entire page or re-render everything. It only changes the output of what's changed. So if it's able to uniquely identify, like this is index 0, this is nav index 1, 2, and 3, giving that key, if you like reorder something or change something, React can just smartly say, okay, I know that only this element changed, so I'm going to only update this screen for this element. So again, it's not required for proper functionality, but it is kind of recommended by React so that it could be more efficient with updating. So again, if you Google this, that's how I kind of understood it. It kind of seems unnecessary, but React does have a purpose for warning that key. So you will see a warning if you leave off that key. Again, let's take off this key. It's called X key. And refresh this page. Notice you get a warning. So each child in the list should have a unique key prop. Again, that's just something you'll see if you don't provide a key for a list of elements that you generate through your JavaScript.
Okay, so that's specifically for lists.
A list, yeah, if you're creating a list of elements. Yep, so regardless if this is a tag, a p tag, it could be any sort of elements. If you're creating a bunch of them kind of dynamically like this, and you're trying to render them, Like I'm rendering a list of elements here. You should give each one of those a unique key. Okay. Thanks for the question. Any other questions about what we did here? So we did article teaser. Again, the goal here was to show some data, which was title and created date. But we also wanted to pass back some value when we clicked on the title. So in this case, we are passing back an ID, and that ID, the parent can use this ID. So this is, again, you're going to see this design over and over again. So make sure you understand it. The parent passed down a handler function so that the child can pass back a value to the parent. That's what's going on here. So the parent said, hey, here's a function I'm providing you. You know, article teaser is a child, or not, is nested within your app component. And then the app article teaser is passing back the ID that it's stored within it so that the parent can know, hey, when you click on this, which item actually got clicked. Right? Okay, so that was our article teaser article. Nothing too exciting going here. We're just rendering some data. The only exciting part, I guess, was we're conditionally rendering the byline and image. And we did that by creating separate functions and returning an element if the first item is true, as in if that's non-null, then we return an element. Otherwise, we return null from get byline and get image. So in that case, if these are null, they won't be actually created in the output. All right, so this was our article component. Again, I think Don asked this question. You can define your functions after you call them because functions are hoisted in JavaScript, which means you can call them first and define them later. That's not true for classes, as in I can't do let A equal new article. This would be an error because article is not defined at this point. Okay, so that is article, and then app nav we just did. The exciting part here, or interesting part, was using the map array function. Again, you can achieve this without using the map function. Again, we did it with a for loop up here, but I would say just get familiar with maps. So definitely use map when you're handling this challenge yourself. All right, let's kind of get to our last part of this challenge, which is converting all this to functional-based components. So let's read the directions. It says after you committed your changes, open a new branch called functional version. Let's do that. So I'm going to go to my terminal, create a branch. So I think it's git branch -b and the name of the branch. So functional version. Okay, functional version. What happened here? Unknown switch. Is that not how you create a branch? Okay. Oh, checkout -b functional. All right, there we go. So I created a new branch. Function. I mistyped it. That is terrible. I can't look like this. So functional. All right, there we go. So we're in functional version. Hopefully you guys didn't have a typo. All right, so we're in a new branch. Let's actually change everything we have into functional components. Again, this is good practice for understanding both. So first, I'm going to go to my app.js and convert this class and get rid of my terminal into a functional-based component. All right, so we're going to do this kind of just line by line. So first, I don't want to use a class, so it's going to be a function. Let's call that function. We don't need to extend the components. So that goes away, function app. All right, so remember for functions, we do not have a constructor. So this function needs to go away, but we still need the logic for it. So the first thing is props. Props are passed directly to the function, so I'll put that up here. We don't need to call base class, so that can go away. We do want to have these items, so we'll keep that there. And then we don't have a this pointer. So functions, I guess functions do have a this pointer, but we don't want to use them for creating state values. So we'll just create state. So we can't just simply create state this way. We need to use something called a use state hook. So do a quick Google. Google, hello. Let's go with hooks in React. Again, when you're using functional-based components, use state. Okay, there's a hooks API reference at react.js.org. You should get to this page when you Google for it. For function-based components, you're gonna have to be familiar with these hooks. Now, there's a lot of them. The three main ones are listed here, basic hooks. So use state, we've talked about in a fair amount. Use effect, we've not touched upon yet. Use context, we've not even mentioned this before. These three, I would say you should kind of master by the end of our React weeks here. So we still got another week and a half of React focused content. These will come up and you will be seeing this a lot. So kind of just expect that. If you want to get a head start, maybe just read into what use effect does, use context. And the fourth one, if you are wanting to take a fourth one, I'd say use ref has some applicability, I guess, that I generally use that for certain purposes. And you kind of want to read about this. I'm not going to get into that right now because that's outside of our confines here. But use state is what we're going to focus on here. So let's click on use state. So again, use state in functional based components. This is how you kind of create state values. So going off of what I'm reading for the reference here, instead of declaring state like this, I'm going to create a nav item. So const nav items, and then set nav items will be the setter function. And this is going to be what use state is. And then my initial value, I guess I could just set that equal to nav items right away. All right, so this is the initial value I'm setting to my new state value of new nav items. Again, it could be a little confusing that I'm calling this the same as this item here. So maybe I want to change that to, I probably should change it. I don't want to match that name. So let's call it, call this data. Yeah, I'll call this data. All right, so we're going to just set that equal to our state value. Again, this is a local variable, or this is a variable that React is not tracking. The purpose of creating a state value is that React can kind of inspect this, this value whenever it changes, and then it can know like, all right, nav items change. I need to maybe potentially re-render something on the screen. All right, so we create that, and then we also create another state value. This will be article. Set article will be our setter, and we want to set that equal to this blob here. So do this piecemeal, create an article, and then use state article. All right. Not sure what's going on here. Let's. All right. Okay, so we create an article object, and we set that local variable. Again, this is a local variable. We set that equal to our state value. So I probably want to set this to some other name so we don't conflict with naming. All right, so we took our state value from before and we created state values in a functional based component. Again, the magic here is calling use state. The problem here is I probably need to import use state. Just need to check up here. Yep, sometimes VS Code adds it for you, but sometimes it doesn't. So I need to get rid of component. I'm not using that anymore, but I'm using use state. And I don't need to react here. All right, any questions about use state? Again, it's going to come up again and again. So if you don't understand it right now, I would say now is the time to ask rather than kind of assuming you'll get it eventually.
Hey, Ankur, what were the four uses to get familiar with? Use state, use effect, use ref, and the fourth one was what? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So if you just go to the documentation page, the basic hooks here: use state, use effect, and use context. We're going to touch upon these in the coming days, so it's not like we're going to leave you on your own. But I just want to let you understand there are a bunch of hooks that exist for functional based components. This is functional based only. This is kind of how you kind of design functional based components. Use state is when you create a state. Use effect is updating from state changes. Again, we'll get into that, I think, in the coming days, so don't worry about that too much right now. Use context, that'll be touched up. I think we'll cover that next week. Use effect, I think, is next week also. The fourth one, use ref. Again, we don't cover it too much, but I will definitely mention it in my lectures because it is useful in certain cases. If you actually read about it, it'll tell you why it's useful, but I'll leave that to you guys if you're curious about it. Okay, all right, so we converted our class-based state values to now using those use state hooks. So we have nav items and article as our state values. So now we don't have a render function. Again, we have our function-based component, so we just need to return what we want to render. So I'm going to do a return here. And change my function into just a return value, so I don't need curly braces here. All right, so I just took that render method, converted it to a return, and changed the curly braces to round braces. So that's what I'm going to eventually return. Now I'm going to get rid of this destruct. I guess I don't need to move that. Sorry. So we have the return statement inside the function. So we just get rid of the render function and have this return method here. I really need to fix my tabbing defaults here. Okay, so we're returning what we had in our render method. So we basically stripped away the render function, but kept the return inside of it. Okay, now, again, we should have something called article, and we should have something called nav items, because those are the states we created above, right? So we have article and nav items. So nav items and article. And then our return is basically what we want to render. So if we want to add some comments, this is our render. These are our states, and these are just move article up here. All right, so we have our states created here. These are just some local variables we're using to initialize our states, state values, and then our render is simply the return method. Okay, and then I think that successfully should have converted this to functional based components. Props, it looks like our app doesn't use props here, so I think we get rid of props. I mean, we can keep it, it doesn't hurt, but it's unused, so that might be a warning for us. But let's see. Okay, so I've changed this to the functional based component. My app teaser, app teaser article. Sorry, I'm reading this incorrectly. App nav, article, and article teaser are still class-based components. That's totally fine. You can mix class-based components and functional-based components. They're still going to work, because what happens behind the scenes is all this JSX is just converted to JavaScript behind the scenes. So, you know, regardless of how you do it, it's going to be handled the same way by React. So we can still proceed here and see if our app works correctly. But normally speaking, you don't want to mix and match class-based components and function-based components in like a project. You want to stick to one. So pick one and stick with it. Don't mix and match in practice. But right now, I just want to see if I've screwed up anything with my app.js or if it still works. So I'm going to save this. Save. Bring up my terminal again. Is my server still running? Yeah, I think it's still running. All right, so go back to my window, refresh. Let's refresh here. All right, still looks like we're getting random articles down below. So it looks good. We get images. You know, my app nav is still here. Let's see if I actually print out some items to my console when I click on them. So I don't think that should change, because this is my component app nav component, which we've not touched from a class-based component to a functional-based component conversion. So that should still work. So yep, it looks like everything's working here. Cool. So we successfully converted our app to a functional-based component. The next challenge is to convert these components into functional-based components. So let's do that. It should be simpler because there's less, there's less going on with each of these components. So again, get more practice here. I want to take this class-based component and convert it to a function. First thing I do is get rid of the class, convert it to a function. Next thing, I don't need to extend component, so that's only for a class. So this is now a function. Get rid of component from here. Let's get rid of this for now. All right, so I got rid of the class declaration, converted to a function, added parentheses because this is a function. This will take in props. Again, remember to add the props to your function-based component here. Again, to highlight, this is not a keyword you want to use for functions, right? So I just want to take off of this keyword, so it's going to be props. My function can stay as is. I just need to add a const there. I don't need a render function. So instead of render, I just strip away that function and have my return. So I'll get rid of render, make sure you get the matching curly brace. So now this is what's returned for my function-based component. And I think everything else should work correctly as long as I get rid of this everywhere. Okay, so that was pretty simple. Again, we definitely want to check to make sure we didn't screw anything up, but What I did was, again, take away the class definition, change the function. We don't need to extend component because that's only for class-based components. And then otherwise, pretty straightforward to convert this to a functional-based component. So let me pause here in case you're trying to follow along or just want to stare at that for a bit.
I do have a question, Ankur.
Yep.
Doesn't hoisting like within the functions also apply to like const, let, and var as well?
Const, let, and var. Yeah, like I guess what's your question? Like if I move this below?
Yeah, like if you had let at the very top, right, and you had that const at the bottom, it technically const would take priority over that, would it not?
Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking. You're saying if I have a const here, but a let above it?
No, so like if you had a let variable at the top and you had that const variable at the bottom again, technically that const would be hoisted above let, would it not? Like,
I guess I'm not quite sure what you're asking. So these are two different variables. Const and let are just different ways of declaring a variable. So let, just to review, let creates a variable that can be changed. So if I create something here, I can change this to something else. So later on in this function, I could say something equals y, and that will be fine. But if I try to change anything that's assigned with const, that is not supposed to be changeable. So if I do handle click equals something else.
yeah, sorry, it was just kind of an offhanded rabbit hole question. I was just kind of curious.
Okay, yeah, but I'm glad you asked. So again, make sure you understand when to use let versus const. So in this case, if I try to reassign handle click, I should get an error. So if you have const here, I'm not sure if VS Code will catch the error for you, but this will be an error because this is saying, me as a developer, I'm saying, hey, I'm creating something called something, and this value should not change after I assign it on this line. That's the purpose of const. Let, on the other hand, says, yep, this is some variable, but you're free to change it at any other point after you initialize it here. So usually you want to pick const unless you want it to change. So const is usually my preferred, I guess, way to declare a variable, unless I know it's going to change later. So that's usually why I go to const here. Okay, let's save this and see if our article teaser works or if we broke it. So go here, refresh the page. Okay, looks like article teaser, where is it? Right here. This is still working. Looks like I'm getting articles with a title. I can click on it. Should be printing out to console. Console, there you are. Yep, I get the ID. So refresh. 19 is the ID for that article. 19 again. That's random. All right, cool. That looks like that's working. I'm happy. Hopefully you guys kind of understand, again, what conversion we did. Again, we get two more things we got to convert. One is article. So article here, again, more practice. We've done this before. Take the class, convert it to a function. So take away the class keyword, make it a function. You don't need to extend component. So here, past this, always remember you need to add props to the function call. It's easy to forget because usually that's handled by the constructor automatically for a class. For your function, you need to have a variable that's capturing the props. All right, we don't have a render method, so we'll get rid of that. We do want to return something. All right, this is an issue with functions though. So if you remember, this was per Don's question or suggestion. In a class, we could create functions below our render method, and it worked fine. So we're calling get byline from our return here, right? In functions, this is not going to work because anytime a function sees a return keyword, anything after it won't be executed. So in this case, again, if you notice, my code is kind of grayed out here. If you hover over it, it says unreachable code detected. And that's because this is a function. It's going to go line by line. It's going to execute line 14, then line 16, and line 16 says return. So it's going to basically get out of this function. Anything below here is not going to be even read by the compiler. So if that's a problem with functions. So I need to put these above. And that's usually why I put them above for class-based components before I actually call them. Again, you don't have to for class-based components, but for functions, you do how to create your objects. Remember to have your const here, because we're back into a function. Okay, so now I have get byline, get image. I want to take away this keyword because that's usually used for classes. And there we go. So I have get byline, which is this function that I created up here, and get image function here. We are deconstructing our props, but we don't have this props, so make sure you update that. But now we're doing the same thing. So we get props passed by our parent component. We're destructuring it here, and make sure you get rid of all your this.props. Looks like I'm not. Byline and image. Okay, so that should be good as long as I get every instance of this out of here. Okay, we're not using our ID, so that is grayed out. We don't have to destructure the ID if we don't want to. So this, you can grab whatever you want out of an object. You don't have to grab everything out of an object. So you have title, abstract, create a date, byline, and image. And we're doing the same thing as before. I'm gonna save this. Check out our article here, refresh. All right, we're still getting our images down here. We're getting our abstract, byline, date, and title. That all looks good. Okay, the last one to do is app nav. All right, app nav. Let's do this one more time. Class, that becomes function. App nav, we'll get parentheses. We don't need to extend component, so that can go away from our imports. This is a function that we created, so I'm going to call it const render nav items. Let's make sure we get rid of all the this items. So, oops, I forgot my props. As I said, easy to forget. So you need some variable that's going to capture the properties that the parent's passing down. So usually you want to call it props. So we have props there, props here, and what else? So I'm just going to get rid of this chunk of code because we're not going to use it. So we still have our map where, let's see, we have render nav items, we return elements, that's going to remain the same. We got to get rid of our render function. So again, this is our function-based component. We don't need a nested render function. We'll get rid of that. And whatever we return here will be rendered by React. So let's return, get rid of your this dot. And I think that's all we had to do. So pretty simple there. Again, app.js was the most difficult because we had state values. So we had to convert the state object into using the use state hook. So there we go. So I'm going to save this. And let's, again, verify that we didn't break anything. So refresh this. All right, looks good. Let's bring up our property inspector and make sure when we click on something from that nav, we get the output. So yep, national, politics, upshot. And my region, business, that looks just fine to me. I guess one thing, I think someone mentioned it, Don might have been you. We do have an extra pipe here. We also have like these spaces are links. Doesn't look that good to me. So we do a quick update since we have some time. Go to my app nav. Let's pull out these spaces from our A tag and put that after our A tag. So now, question, why do I have errors here? Anyone know?
The semicolon?
Not the semicolon, that's fine. The issue here is I'm returning multiple elements. Remember, you need to have one, I guess that's not the issue, sorry. Yep, sorry, you want to return
Just
one.
need a div.
Yeah, so add a div, and I can toss these in there. That should take care of it. Yep, so again, you want one parent element when you're returning something. You can't return more than one element in this manner. So I wrapped it in a div. Again, divs don't really take up any space. They're just kind of sections. So div is my parent element here. Now I could return multiple elements here. And so I pulled out these items, but so if I save this, notice that's broken. So that's not what I wanted.
Shouldn't you make it a span?
Yep. Great catch there. So divs, each div will be a block level element, which will take up the horizontal space. Spans, on the other hand, will not take up. There you go. Yep, good call, Sarah. So it looks better. I still have that last pipe. So let's actually get rid of that pipe. Or let's actually, I want to add a pipe before home. So I could do it either or, but I kind of like these pipes kind of being like tabs almost. So let's add a pipe before home. So to do that, I just need to, how do I do this? Let's create. How would I add a pipe? I could add it here, but if I have 0 elements, it's not going to look right. So let's say if elements dot length greater than 0, let's turn. All right, this isn't the most elegant way to do it. I'm sure I could do better.
Can't you just check the index
Don't
and do it as the first item in your span?
Yeah, that's actually a good suggestion. I'm not sure why I was going down this route. Thank you. I appreciate that suggestion. Yep. So here we could do a conditional. So it's going to be if index equals 0, then we want to show a pipe and some spaces. I'm going to copy this.
I like the
Otherwise,
ampersand's better.
what'd you say?
I like the and better. You don't have to throw the null in.
And I see. So gotcha. Yep, that works too. So now this is saying, hey, if our index does equal 0, render this stuff over here. Otherwise, it will render nothing for this line. So do have an error here where we put a p tag or a span at least. Span this. Okay, let's have a look. Save this. There we go. So I have this leading pipe here. Probably hard to see because it's really on the edge, but again, now I have these kind of tab looking things. So it looks much better than, again, the first time we ran this, remember that all this text was kind of crammed together. So hopefully you guys can make it look somewhat nice. And then we will be adding some styling with our future releases. So there'll be some CSS we're going to ask you guys to do, but otherwise, I think that takes care of my functional based component, plus a bonus of cleaning up my app nav here.
You took care of those ugly underscores going all the way across too.
Yep, yeah, so I did that by pulling out my spaces outside of the A tag. So anything inside your A tag will have the hyperlink kind of formatting for it. Okay, cool. So I think that takes care of this. Let me commit it. Git add. Git commits. And with that, we're approaching lunchtime. Any questions about React? So we still have stand down today, so we can cover any topics there. Let me stop